This week's episode of Naked Mormonism is brought to you by our sponsor, HelloFresh. Visit HelloFresh.com and enter promo code NAKED30 to get $30 off your first week of food delivery service.
This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 86 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 18th, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, Joe and friends have been busy for the first week of April of 1841. We examine Joe's enclave of Nauvoo through the eyes of the most pressing business to be handled through the April General Conference. Rigdon steps aside to make room for John Wreck-it Bennett to be Joe's left-hand man. The magnitude of the Nauvoo Temple project is realized, and the leadership fills those pesky vacancies in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and other prominent leadership bodies left by the deaths of David Patten and others. Let's get into it. April of 1841 was abnormally busy for the Mormons and Joseph Smith. April 5th, Joe was sealed to his first polygamous wife in Nauvoo, Louisa Beeman, and then April 6th, the cornerstone ceremony for the Nauvoo Temple was held, with the Nauvoo Legion out in full force, parading around town, and then the rest of the week was soaked up by a major conference held after the 11th anniversary of the foundation of the Church of Christ. We've been covering certain aspects of this week for a number of episodes. Episode 77 was all about the temple dedication ceremony, and from there back to episode 74, we've hit on small elements that are all congregating on this week in Mormon history. In episode 74, we covered a significant portion of Doctrine and Covenants section 124, which was the first canonized revelation given in Nauvoo. It was a motherlode of a revelation, comprised of 145 verses in today's Doctrine and Covenants, and it touched on the creation of a number of committees and organizations and the specific directives for certain members of the Mormon elite and what they should do with their personal wealth. In that episode, we briefly touched on some reorganization of the leadership, so I'll just refer you back to episode 74, titled Foster Pulls a Pistol on Joseph Smith, for a bit of backstory concerning what we're about to discuss in this episode. The church operated in semi-annual blocks in Joe's day, and to a certain extent it still does today. Whenever organizational changes or general authorities are added or taken away from the Quorum of the 70s all the way up to the Quorum of the 15, the changes happen in the background all year, but they're solemnized and created as church record in April and October during general conferences. For the second segment of this episode, we'll be discussing what this means in context of today's church leadership and how it slightly differs from how Joe initially organized his hierarchy. The point is, in Joe's church, leadership changes were called for and voted on during April and October conferences, which lasted much longer than the weekend conferences that are held today. The leadership in Nauvoo had been in a constant state of flux since the Mormons began moving into the Illinois area en masse from late 1838 on to where our current historical timeline resides. The April 1841 conference included a lot of business from the previous 6 months and a couple years actually, which needed to be voted on and set into stone. We'll be discussing a number of prominent names in this episode. With very few exceptions, these names will be the same names which constituted the leadership of the church when Joe and Hiram were assassinated in June of 1844. I can't stress enough how important many of these people were in early church history, and we're not even discussing the Quorum of the 12 in the large part today. we'll be primarily focusing on the elites that were in Nauvoo, as the Quorum of the 12 had yet to make it back to the States from their missionary trip in Europe. They were just about to board ships to head on over across the Atlantic. We'll spend the historical portion of today's episode reading the minutes from the April 1841 conference. So you guys have to be fellow historical masochists like myself to find joy and pleasure in reading conference minutes like this, or else you wouldn't be here listening to this episode. So let's dive right in and see what information can be garnered from this one conference spanning over 5 days total in the second week of April 1841. So beginning on Wednesday, that's the 7th of April, 1841, the conference convened in Nauvoo. The meeting was called to order and a dedicatory prayer was offered by William Law. William Law, of course, will become very, very prominent as we continue to move forward. He eventually is called to be one of Joseph's personal counselors, but not quite yet. The conference began with a powerful oration by Joseph Smith, recounting the struggles and the prosperity of the saints in every place the church had expanded to by that point. Beginning on page 334 of Volume 4 of the Dan Vogel History of the Church Source and Text Critical Edition, Joe begins by taking stock of the land and human resources the church had and had recently acquired. How great was the shadow to be cast by Talos. Quote, "It is with unfeigned pleasure that they have to make known the steady and rapid increase of the church in this state, the United States, and Europe." I mean, just starting out strong. The anxiety to become acquainted with the principles of the gospel on every hand is intense, and the cry of "Come over and help us" is reaching the elders on the wings of every wind, while thousands who have heard the gospel have become obedient thereto and are rejoicing in its gift and blessings. Prejudice, with its attendant train of evils, is giving way before the force of truth, whose benign rays are penetrating the nations afar off. The reports from the 12 apostles in Europe are very satisfactory, and state that the work continues to progress with unparalleled rapidity, and that the harvest is truly great. In the eastern states, the faithful laborers are successful and many are flocking to the standard of truth, nor is the South keeping back. Churches have been raised up in southern and western states, and a very pressing invitation has been received from New Orleans for some of the elders to visit that city, which has been complied with. In our own state and immediate neighborhood, many are avowing their attachment to the principles of our holy religion and have become obedient to the faith. Peace and prosperity attend us, and we have favor in the sight of God and virtuous men. The time was when we were looked upon as deceivers, and that Mormonism would soon pass away, come to naught, and be forgotten. But the time has gone by, when it was looked upon as a transient matter or a bubble on the wave, and it is now taking a deep hold in the hearts and affections of those who are noble-minded enough to lay aside the prejudice of education and investigate the subject with candor and honesty. The truth, like the sturdy oak, has stood unhurt amid the contending elements, which have beat upon it with tremendous force. The floods have rolled, wave after wave, in quick succession, and have not swallowed it up." End quote. A nice, strong start there from Joe, and after that he goes on to publicly declare that members of this church will be famous to their posterity as saints of God and virtuous men if they just suffer for a little bit longer in this mortal coil. After that, he once again praises the state legislature for incorporating Nauvoo and granting them such a liberal charter to the Mormons. Then he goes on to reiterate the importance of building the Nauvoo Temple, stating, quote, "In consequence of the impoverished condition of the saints, the buildings which are in course of erection do not progress as fast as could be desired. But from the interest which is generally manifested by the saints at large, we hope to accomplish much by a combination of effort and a concentration of action, and erect the temple and other buildings, which we so much need for our mutual instruction and the education of our children. We would call the attention of the saints more particularly to the building of the temple, for on its speedy erection great blessings depend. The zeal which is manifested by the saints in this city is, indeed, praiseworthy, and, we hope, will be imitated by the saints in the various stakes and branches of the church, and that those who cannot contribute labor will bring their gold and their silver, their brass and their iron, with the pine tree and box tree, to beautify the same. In conclusion, we would say, brethren, be faithful. Let your love and moderations be known unto all men. Be patient, be mindful to observe all the commandments of your heavenly Father, and the God of all grace shall bless you. Even so, amen." End quote. That was just a couple snapshots out of Joe's oration there. But Joe was no Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon when it came to oratory. But he could rile up a crowd for a general conference pretty well. And Rigdon had become a very good mentor to Joseph over the past 7 or 8 years when it came to public speaking. With Joe's speech and exhortation out of the way, the brethren could finally get to the necessary business that they were there for in the first place. So first, let's talk about one of the most important business items in this conference to which Joe referred, and that's the Nauvoo Temple. This is from page 339 of volume 4 out of the Vogel History of the Church. Quote, President Joseph Smith made some observations respecting the duty of the several quorums in sending their members into the vineyard, and also stated that labor on the temple would be as acceptable to the Lord as preaching in the world, and that it was necessary that some agents should be appointed to collect funds for the building of the temple. Resolved, that John Murdoch, Lyman White, William Smith, Henry W. Miller, Amasa Lyman, Leonard Sobey, Gehiel Savage, and Zenas H. Gurley be appointed to travel and collect funds for the same. The building committee were called upon to address the assembly. Elder Reynolds Cahoon spoke at length on the importance of the building of the temple and called upon the saints to assist them in their great undertaking. Elder Alpheus Cutler made some very appropriate remarks. End quote. The Mormons simply can't function without the need to build a temple, and their fixation with the Nauvoo Temple served to be one of their greatest challenges through all of Nauvoo years. But you gotta admit, a Mormon colossus donning the modern-day Nauvoo Temple as a crown with tens of thousands of Mormons trailing in the wake of destruction would surely put the fear of God in the hearts of every damn mobocrat and government official who dare oppose the will of the prophet. But the business of raising funds for the construction of the Nauvoo Temple wasn't the only item of business that needed to be handled here at this April General Conference. So let's go to the next passage. And here we find an issue with somebody who either opposed or didn't fall in line behind the prophet. We can see a brief window into somebody stepping aside when they were unable to fulfill their duties. And I don't know if there's any way to see behind the scenes of what really happened with the next passage that we're going to read here. I don't know whose idea this was, but I know the effects of this decision. The temple dedication ceremony the previous day apparently took its toll on Hinchpin Rigdon, who had been in a very fragile state since his time in Liberty Jail during the winter of 1838-39. So, Hinchpin Rigdon decided to yield his position of third in command to Joseph Smith to John Wreck-it Bennett. From page 336 of the Vogel History of the Church, volume 4, quote, President Rigdon arose and stated that, in consequence of weakness from his labors of yesterday, he would call upon General John C. Bennett to officiate in his place. End quote. So here we go. Hinchpin Rigdon was no longer able to contribute, or he wasn't fulfilling his duties well enough, so he voluntarily stepped up to the pulpit and stood aside. I don't know. Wreck-it Bennett, though, was really happy to hold the position of third in command to Joe while Rigdon was recovering. And I don't know, maybe Joe told Rigdon at some point, hey, look, you're not feeling well. Just give your seat up to Bennett. He'll keep it warm for you while you recover, and then he'll give it back to you as soon as you ask for it or something. But maybe Rigdon was also fed up with Joe, and he was looking for his first possible out, and he used Bennett as his exit strategy, because Rigdon was hardly a piece of the Mormon puzzle throughout most of Nauvoo history. I honestly don't know how to interpret what happened here, and I don't think there is truly a way for historians to know exactly what happened here for sure. Regardless of the inciting incident that put Wreck-it Bennett on Joe's left hand, Bennett took to his new office like a trilobite to water. Quote, General Bennett then read the revelations from the Book of the Law of the Lord, which had been received since the last General Conference, in relation to writing a proclamation to the kings of the earth, building a temple in Nauvoo, the organization of the church, etc. General Bennett read the charters granted by the legislature of this state for incorporating the city of Nauvoo, the Nauvoo Legion, the University of the City of Nauvoo, the Agricultural and Manufacturing Association, and the Nauvoo House Association. On motion, resolved that the charters now read be received by the church. Carried unanimously. So, Wreck-it Bennett had the task of reading all of the proposals and the Nauvoo charter to the leadership here in this general conference, and they voted on whether or not they were going to receive it. And it was a unanimous vote. So then it continues on. General John C. Bennett then spoke at some length on the present situation, prospects, and condition of the church, and remarked that the hand of God must indeed be visible in accomplishing the great blessings and prosperity of the church, and called upon the saints to be faithful and obedient in all things, and likewise forcibly and eloquently urged the necessity of being united in all their movements. And before he sat down, he wished to know how many of the saints who were present felt disposed to continue to act in concert and follow the instruction of the First Presidency, and called upon all those who did so to arise on their feet, when immediately the saints, almost without exception, arose. End quote. Really fascinating piece here. So, General Bennett obviously took to his new official office as acting member of the First Presidency of the church in the place of the sickly Hingepin Rigdon, and he stood up and gave this incredible speech, and he said, "If all of you are in support of the First Presidency, stand." And it says, almost without exception, everybody arose. Look, these are the only surviving minutes from this meeting. But given the general tenor and mood of the saints from their independent reminiscences and journals, early Nauvoo years were a time of great apostasy to counterbalance the overwhelming zeal that many of these people had. There were plenty of members and even a few of the elites who weren't quite so excited about everything that they had suffered through in the moves from Kirtland and Missouri, and, needless to say, some murmurings, even among the Mormon elite, could be heard whispered over the silence of supplication to the Lord. Very fascinating. If only we could be a fly on the wall and see what was really going on behind the scenes. Previous to all of this, any major motions that were undertaken by the High Council or the First Presidency, they required a vote of unanimity. But when conflicts arise between certain members of the church leadership and those conflicts reach critical mass, a unanimous vote on anything becomes increasingly impossible. Joe responded to the infighting that was going on by changing the voting requirements with the following proposition. Quote, President Joseph Smith declared the rule of voting to be a majority in each quorum. A majority instead of unanimity. Wow. Exhorted them to deliberation, faith, and prayer, and that they should be strict and impartial in their examinations. He then told them that the presidents of the different quorums would be presented before them for their acceptance or rejection. End quote. After that, this is a really interesting power play by Joseph and Wreck-it Bennett here, because after that, it lists each of the presidency and the quorum that they represented. We had Newell Whitney presenting the First Presidency of the Lesser Priesthood. Then we have John A. Hicks presenting the Elders Quorum. Joseph Young, who was Brigham Young's brother, presented the Quorum of the 70s. And then Don Carlos Smith presented the High Priest Quorum. And then finally, Elias Higbee presented the High Council. So each of these constituent presidents over each quorum voiced their accordance with the ruling body of the First Presidency, comprised of by Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, and Wreck-it Bennett as acting president until Hingepin Rigdon had recovered. So each president of these quorums voiced their intention to fall in line behind the presidency. But then each group of presidents were presented to the bodies whom they represented to be sustained as the presidency of each of their respective quorums. So this was the best way to evaluate whether, more than 100 men in all of these leadership positions are actually in line with Joseph Smith in the First Presidency. You have the presidents of each of their quorums presenting themselves, and then when they are all accepted by the First Presidency, then they go back to their quorums and present themselves to their quorums and make sure that the quorums accept those people as their presidents. It's kind of an electoral college way of making sure that everybody is kind of okay with the leadership how it stands. So what ended up happening? Well, the bodies ended up rejecting a number of the participants, and Bishop Newell K. Whitney moved their cases to be tried before their respective quorums at a later time. Now, we'll see if these various presidents were ever challenged successfully or not, but I honestly have my doubts. The names listed are pretty much in line with how the presidency existed in Nauvoo at the time of Joe and Hiram's deaths, with a few minor exceptions of those names. So it's very fascinating to see this power play kind of play out and see that when somebody did raise a challenge, there really wasn't much of an answer to it. Then the leadership decided to move on from, making sure that everybody is loyal to some business that it had been putting on for quite some time by April 1841. Now, you may be able to remember Captain Fearnought. He recklessly charged into the battle on Crooked River back in October of 1838 in Missouri before he was shot by the Missouri militia and died an excruciating death hours later. This is from page 338 of Volume 4 of the Dan Vogel History of the Church. Quote, President Smith observed that it was necessary that someone should be appointed to fill the quorum of the 12 apostles in the room of the late elder David W. Patten. That's Captain Fearnought. Whereupon President Rigdon nominated Elder Lyman White to that office, which was unanimously accepted. I find this interesting. President Rigdon, prior to this passage, had stepped aside to allow Wreck-it Bennett to be the acting president in his place. However, Rigdon was still attending this general conference, and it was his duty to nominate Lyman White, who was an old friend from his Campbellite days, into the office of the Quorum of the 12. So, Rigdon had stepped aside, but was still exercising some authority. An interesting power play. Elder White stated that it was an office of great honor and responsibility, and he felt inadequate to the task, but inasmuch as it was the wish of the authorities of the church that he should take that office, he would endeavor to magnify it. Resolved that James Allred be appointed to the office of High Counselor in the place of Charles C. Rich, who had been chosen a counselor to the president of this stake, and that Leonard Sobey be appointed one of the High Council in the room of David Dort, deceased. End quote. And just like that, these men and General Lyman White, a Mormon elite from many moons ago, was given the office of High Councilman and, in General Lyman White's case, Quorum of the 12 Apostle, in the place of deceased men that, had all died from 1838 to 1841. That's how long it took to fill these vacancies. And then there were some other vacancies that were filled, and then some of the leadership was put on notice for, not falling perfectly in line with the elite leadership. We're going to skip over those passages because they're really not consequential. So to take a step back, a point that I'm trying to get to with all of this is so much of church organization had just been a patchwork mess of disparate revelations and pieces hastily woven together to form some kind of coherent authoritative body. With each person passing away in the early Nauvoo years and then, schisms happening during Missouri in the earliest Nauvoo years, there were a lot of deaths and a lot of defections up to this point, and each of those popped another hole in the fragile tapestry of Mormon leadership. And it was only fairly recently that Joe had replaced most of this patchwork with a single revelation cobbling so much together, but each dissenter and each death, of which there were plenty, tore away little pieces of this tapestry as they left, making the entire safety net of governing power held by the church look more like thinly sliced pieces of Swiss cheese hurriedly sewn together at the edges. So really, if you're going to rule the world one day, you need a solid set of rules and a hierarchy that's filled with loyal followers who will follow every word that you say, as if it came from God himself, or, some kind of dogmatic authority or something to that effect. So it was important that Joe continually tweaked and examined the structure that he put in place, as well as evaluate the loyalty of his followers in order to keep himself on top of the pyramid. And Joe couldn't do this alone. Who could he trust the most to never betray him and always be loyal? Well, Doctrine and Covenants section 124 offers some very important insight. It should be noted, Doctrine and Covenants 124 was given back in January of 1841. That was the first Nauvoo revelation, really. But it wasn't widely distributed and known until this April conference when it was read out loud. So most of the information in it was known by some people, but by and large, most of the hierarchy was hearing this information for the first time. So, from Doctrine and Covenants section 124, we're going to start with verse 15 through 16, and this is, we're going somewhere with this. This is important. Quote, And again, verily, I say unto you, blessed is my servant Hiram Smith, for I, the Lord, love him because of the integrity of his heart, and because he loveth that which is right before me, saith the Lord. Again, let my servant John C. Bennett help you in your labor in sending my word to the kings and the people of this earth, and stand by you, even you, my servant Joseph Smith, in the hour of affliction, and his word shall not fail if he receive counsel. Here we go. A revelation coming from God saying you can trust Hiram Smith and John Bennett to be there in your time of need and to be your liaisons, your diplomats that go and meet with the kings and the leaders of the world. And the Lord loves these people because of the integrity in their heart. Very interesting. But this is not the only piece. The little tiny chunk there with John Bennett is kind of fascinating, but there's so much more when it comes to Hiram Smith here. And this is where William Law is appointed to be Joseph's counselor. But at this time, Hiram Smith was Joseph's counselor. Hiram needed to be elevated in order to put William Law into his place. So here we go, beginning with verse 91. We jumped from verses 15 and 16 all the way down to 91 of this same Doctrine and Covenants section 124. It says, "And again, verily I say unto you, let my servant William Law be appointed, ordained, and anointed as counselor unto my servant Joseph, in the room of my servant Hiram, that my servant Hiram may take the office of priesthood and patriarch, which was appointed unto him by his father by blessing and also by right." Now you remember back to the death of Joseph Smith episode where we talked about Joseph Smith Sr. becoming, viciously afflicted and then ended up dying in September of 1840. He gave parting blessings to all of his kids. The blessing he gave to Hiram Smith was that you will be the next patriarch of this church, which at this time, patriarchs weren't a dime a dozen like they are in the church today. There was a patriarch of the church. Not patriarchs to the church, that they are now. There's a patriarch of the church, meaning that Joseph Smith's office basically stood above and beyond the presidency of the church. It was a separate office, the father of the church. And Hiram Smith, by the death of Joseph Smith Sr., was appointed to this new office. So Hiram is taking a massive promotion here, so William Law needs to be put into his place as counselor to Joseph Smith. And it goes on to say that from henceforth he shall hold the keys of the patriarchal blessings upon the heads of all my people. That whoever he blesses shall be blessed, and whoever he curses shall be cursed. That whatsoever he shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever he shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now this is where it gets really interesting. And from this time forth I appoint unto him that he may be a prophet and a seer and a revelator unto my church, as well as my servant Joseph, that he may act in concert also with my servant Joseph, and that he shall receive counsel from my servant Joseph, who shall show unto him the keys whereby he may ask and receive, and be crowned with the same blessing, and glory and honor, and priesthood, and the gifts of the priesthood that once were put upon him that was my servant Oliver Cowdery." End quote. This was Joe's way of elevating his brother Hiram to the level where he and Hiram were essentially equals in the church. And he also endowed Hiram with the power of patriarchal blessings, which, only Joseph Sr., Big Daddy Cheese, had done before his death back in, 1840. So now, not only were Hiram and Joe equals, but Hiram had the power of patriarch of the church to give patriarchal blessings. This is really very interesting because this means that there is no second in authority to Joseph Smith other than Hiram. It is Joseph and Hiram are running this church here. And then the first presidency resides somewhere underneath Joseph and Hiram. But this became a major problem when it comes to the succession crisis after Joe's death, because he had named upwards of 11 people to be his successors. But Hiram was the only one with an office that was equal to Joe, and he either should have been the right successor or Hiram should have appointed the rightful successor after Joe's death. But Hiram and Joe died at the same time, so any plans to have Hiram be the prophet, seer, and revelator upon Joe's death were destroyed, and there were way too many questions left behind. So this revelation, Doctrine and Covenants 124, was voted on and received as church canon at this April conference amidst all of the trouble with evaluating loyalties of the various groups of leadership. Joe knew that he could trust just a few people, so he brought Hiram, his own brother, up to his same level. He put William Law, that he knew he could trust, in the position of Hiram Smith as his counselor, and then he moved John Bennett into the place of Hingepin Rigdon because he thought that he could trust John Bennett more than he could trust Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. all at once, right here in April of 1841, a bunch of positions are moving around. It's kind of fascinating to see. And of course, there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to Hyrum Smith, so stick around until the end of the episode to hear much more about him. So after this April 1841 conference, Joe had a few important pieces in place. The church had voted to accept the Nauvoo Charter and all of the associations and committees that it had created. They had a plan to collect money to finally get to work on the Nauvoo Temple. And now Hyrum was upgraded from being Joe's shadow as his counselor to being his right-hand man on basically the same authoritative level. And Joe just emplaced a number of men into the various presidencies whom he knew for a fact that he could trust. However, both Hyrum and Joe would continue to rule the church as equals from this time forward. It's not seen that way. I mean, Hyrum is not very well discussed in church history. It's always, Joseph Smith, the founding prophet, but his contributions are much less easy to quantify than Joseph Smith's. But they were essentially equals. And Joe now finally had plans for the control panel and a co-pilot that he could trust here. So, on paper, not quite in practice yet, but on paper, Talos is starting to look like a formidable plan. Hey everybody, we just got to take a quick break to talk about this week's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that does all of the shopping and planning and delivery for all your favorite step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients. So all you have to do is just open up the box, cook, eat, and enjoy the food. They're incredibly convenient. Basically what you do, you log on to HelloFresh, you make an account, you choose what delivery days you want for your busy schedule. You can pause your account for weeks at a time or any amount of time when you're out of town. And all of the ingredients that you need for all of these delicious recipes come in pre-measured, handy labeled meal kits. So you know which ingredients go with which recipe. And then it's delivered right to your door in this recyclable, insulated packaging. Also, they have an incredible selection and flexibility as well. HelloFresh offers a wide variety of chef-curated recipes, and they change weekly. There are hundreds to choose from. There are 3 different meal plans. You can go with the classic meals, the veggie meals, or upgrade to the family meals. The classic comes with a variety of meat and fish and all of the seasonal produce. Veggie comes with a vegetarian recipes with plant-based proteins and grains and seasonal produce, so you can make sure that even if you're restricted by meat eating, you can have a balanced diet. And then the family size, of course, comes with quick and easy meals for all of the yum-worthy flavor for the entire family. My favorite part about HelloFresh is how simple it is. You're not going to spend all night in the kitchen. You don't have to spend hours grocery shopping and trying to find that one ingredient that's never in the aisle you think it's in and have to buy a bunch of excess of it and have extra laying around the house that just spoils. All you have to do is dig into the box, and it only takes about 30 minutes to cook these delicious home-cooked meals. There's lots of single-dish recipes for fast cooking and really easy cleanup, and then each week there's a 20-minute meal on the classic menu for when you really don't have more time than that. On a personal level, I'm a big fan of the Southwestern stuffed peppers. That was one of my favorite recipes, and my favorite part about this is these recipes are scalable. So we have a couple of friends coming into town this weekend. We're going to treat them to a delicious meal of Southwestern stuffed peppers. It comes with ground beef, quinoa, and Monterey Jack cheese, along with, these beautiful hearty red bell peppers, yellow onion, scallions. It comes with everything that you need, all in this convenient packaging. You can feel confident because they come with these simple recipes that are outlined with pictured step-by-step instruction cards. It's incredibly easy. So you can enjoy not having to plan dinner and spend money on takeout for an easy night or, worry about gathering all of the necessary ingredients. It's just all there ready for you. And it's less than $10 a meal. Yeah, $10. It's an incredibly good deal for home-cooked, balanced, nutritious food. It's really an incredible deal. So if you go to HelloFresh and enter promo code NAKED30, you're going to get $30 off your first week of deliveries. That's a really good deal. I mean, that's 3 free meals. And with meals that are less than $10 and in a convenient planning and delivery schedule, you really can't go wrong with HelloFresh. So be sure to go to HelloFresh.com and enter promo code NAKED30. Once again, HelloFresh.com, promo code NAKED30. All right, one more piece of business to get to here. We need a Hiram nickname, okay? There's one piece of the Mormon puzzle which we've yet to really examine and bring in properly to our timeline. Hiram Smith. Comparatively speaking, Hiram is a bit of an enigma when it comes to Mormon history. He's always overshadowed by his younger brother. Only one comprehensive biography has ever been written about Hiram, and the Hiram Smith Papers is a project the church is currently working on to shed a bit more light on his contribution to Mormon history. Hiram Smith was Joseph's closest confidant. Once Alvin passed away in 1823, Hiram Smith took over as the eldest brother and emotional support for his younger siblings. If you watch the Mormon movies depicting Hiram, you'll see him throw Joe over his back and run through a field when, this young child Joe was limping on crutches from his recent leg surgery. Now, he's been present on the outskirts of our historical timeline since day one, but we've yet to focus on him at any level just beyond, mentioning him when Joe would send him on a mission or something to that effect. So we need to give Hiram a proper nickname for our timeline. So in order to do that, of course, as with the modus operandi of all of these nicknames, we need some background to get the creative juices flowing. Hiram was born in 1800 to the Smith family in Vermont, a mere 5 years older than his younger brother, Joseph. Possibly as an homage to Joseph Sr.'s dabbling in masonry with his fellow fraternity of rodsmen, the initial spelling of Hiram Smith was actually Hiram, not Hyrum. And that is the Masonic spelling of the central character of the third-degree Masonic ascendancy ritual involving the allegory of Hiram Abiff. Little is known of Hiram's early history. He assisted Joe in the printing process of the Book of Mormon. He was running copies of the manuscript to and from the Grandin printing press for the last 6 months of 1829. From the foundation of the church, Hiram was inextricably tied to Joseph. He became a member of the Canandaigua Masonic Lodge in 1826. That happened about the same time that some of the other Smiths and Hiram joined up with the Methodist Church in Manchester. And it was about this same time that Hiram began spelling his name Hyrum instead of the Masonic Hiram. Now, he was always a support for Joseph, okay? When Joseph had something that needed to be done, Hiram was there to pick up the slack. When Joe would go out partying, Hiram was right there with him racing and flipping over horse carriages in a drunken stupor. When collecting funds for the church, Hiram was usually on the forefront of the effort, personally knocking on doors and asking members for money to build this temple or help buy that printing press or whatever. Hiram was there for Zion's Camp, for the Kirtland Safety Society. He attended most of the prayer meetings Joe held where there were dozens or so guys who were seeing angels after partaking the Lord's Sacrament. Every single step of the way, Hiram has been right next to Joe. But this whole time, we've only ever mentioned him as a backdrop character. It's a shame, and it's a failing on my part, and I'm sorry about that. So, let's bring Hiram out of Joe's shadow and into the harsh, white-hot light of historical scrutiny by giving him his very own Namo nickname. And I worked on these forever. I'm really going to need help because my proposed nicknames are terrible. So Hiram was the initial person to steal this chocolate-colored stone from Willard Chase. And they found that chocolate-colored stone while they were digging a well on the Chase farm. Digging a well or treasure hunting, sometimes the only distinction between the two was whether or not they struck water or they struck buried treasure first. So they were almost always digging wells. Hiram, quote-unquote, borrowed the stone from Willard, and then when Willard went back to the Smith farm at a later time and accused Hiram and Joe of stealing the precious seer stone, Hiram viciously defended his brothers and his own actions by calling Willard Chase a liar for insinuating that they would stoop so low as to steal a seer stone. That same stone, that chocolate-colored stone, was likely the same stone that Joe used to translate the Book of Mormon. If not for Hiram stealing that stone from Willard Chase, the Book of Mormon might never have come to be. Really interesting, right? So, maybe we can pay homage to Hiram's namesake with some of this insider masonry and treasure digging and stuff like that. Why not Hycatia? Hycatia? Get it? Hiram? Hycatia? Okay. Hiram was one of the main proponents and overseers of the Kirtland Temple. He was one of the first to break ground in the digging the foundation. He oversaw collecting funds. He performed days' worth of carpentry and masonry work during the construction process. I mean, you can even see the initials HS carved with a knife into the wood of the belfry tower in the Kirtland Temple. And the people who take care of it think that that HS is indeed our boy Hiram Smith. Even if insignificant or unperceived, Hiram always left his mark. For anyone who's read Quinn's Magic Worldview, Agla. That makes a pretty good name for Hiram. Agla? Knife being carved with the ceremonial knife. Okay. Hiram was also on a mission to the eastern states in 1837. He was likely collecting funds to bail the church out of debt from the Kirtland Safety Society and Temple Project when his wife, Jerusha Barden, gave birth to his child and, unfortunately, died from injuries sustained during childbirth. And that happened in October of 1837. In response to this, Joe, being the wingman that he was quick to matchmake Hiram out of his widower depression by offering him Mary Fielding, to whom Hiram was married a mere 2 months after the death of Jerusha Barden. And that was less than a year after that, they had Joseph F. Smith, who would later become prophet of the Brighamite sect, born in Missouri in 1838. Being so quick on the rebound like this, I mean, his wife dies in childbirth and 2 months later he's married again and having another kid. He's quick on the rebound. Maybe we should go with some, a nickname that's a lot less esoteric, like Racquetball Hiram, his ability to rebound. Like a racquetball rebounds. Yeah. Yeah. Then there's a little love triangle that was going on between Hiram, Joe, and Emma. It was reported at a much later date that when Joe and Hiram's bodies were returned to Nauvoo after Carthage, Emma ran to Hiram's casket first, while Eliza Snow ran to Joe's casket first. And both of these women were inconsolably sobbing at the loss of their true loves. Hiram's other 3 wives seemed just as broken up about his death, but they would end up going on to marry other Mormon elites like Heber Kimball. But Emma, I think she held a certain affinity towards Hiram. So whether it was a rod cut from a witch hazel plant, or an iron rod for constructing the temple, or a hollowed out wooden rod used to smoke tobacco and other narcotics, or if he was using the rod of nature that Hiram himself grew, Hiram knew how to handle rods. Hiram, the man of many rods. High rod, if you will. High rod. Yeah, high rod. All right. Okay. You see, Hiram is a really hard name to play with here. Okay. But you guys are more creative than me. Okay. You know how to play along. You can vote for your favorite Hiram Smith name-o nickname of High Rod, Racquetball, Agla, or Hycatia. Personally, Hycatia is my favorite. Or you can come up with a much better one, probably much easier than I can, by posting it on Twitter with hashtag NameONickname, or on Facebook, and you can quote the tweet about this, or quote the Facebook post about the episode coming out, and I'm going to arbitrarily pick the winner from this terrible list, or from any that are proposed, and I will be happy to plug whoever it is that is our winner. And in response to our previous week, huge shout out to Jonathan Tyndall, not only for providing his voice for the intro for the past few weeks, but also for endearing our Mormon Titan with a perfectly fitting name of Talos. So be sure to give Jonathan Tyndall a follow at Secular Stories on Twitter, or Jonathan Tyndall or Secular Stories on Facebook. Here's just a little side note. Some may view that our Mormon dreadnought idea here is a ham-fisted storytelling mechanism, or gasp, an anachronistic construct that's superfluously added to an already complex history. While those are valid criticisms based on opinion, with what we have in store, you'll just have to trust me that the utility of Talos will outweigh the sheer stupidity of a Mormon Titan's existence. With that, we need to shut it down for the evening. We don't have any new patrons to thank, but if you want to pledge to support the show and fund the research that goes into this show and compiling notes and 17 pages of script, you can do so by pledging at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and you'll gain access to ad-free editions of every episode and a whole bunch of extra content. We can go through all the fracking bad movies and through all of the extra readings, all of the extra episodes, the extra interviews, the Name of Home evenings. There's a ton of extra content to get there. So if you can't get enough Mormon history in your life, be sure to sign up to support. Or you can be like Linda, who pledged a monthly recurring donation straight to PayPal. which doesn't, introduce Patreon into the whole mix. So if you want to do that, you can go to nakedmormonismpodcast.com, and on the home screen on the right side of the page, you'll find a donate button. And thank you so much to Linda for doing so. And of course, thank you so much to Julie for running the Facebook and Twitter pages. She is our social media guru and keeps the conversation going over there. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing music going into your ear right now. Go to aloststateofmind.com to get more of his music there. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast for providing legal counsel and business ideas for this show. Be sure to give him a follow at OpenArgs on Twitter. Thank you once again to all the patrons and supporters who support this monetarily, and most importantly, thank you most of all to the preposterously wonderful listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. And again, verily, I say unto you, if my servant Sidney will serve me and be counselor unto my servant Joseph, let him arise and come up and stand in his office of his calling and humble himself before me. And if he will offer unto me an acceptable offering and acknowledgments and remain with my people, behold, I, the Lord your God, will heal him, that he shall be healed, and he shall lift up his voice again on the mountains and be a spokesman before my face. Let him come and locate his family in the neighborhood in which my servant Joseph resides. If only Sidney Rigdon would have given more devotion and offering and everything else to Joseph, maybe God would have healed him and accepted him as a spokesman once again before my face. If only. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.